Well, the response in the United States to the death of George Floyd has been enormous, as we've seen. Thousands have taken to the streets to protest against the death of black men in the custody of white police officers. Now, here in Australia, Indigenous deaths in custody is a problem that often fails to command the same social and political attention. Shadow Indigenous Affairs spokeswoman Linda Burney joins us now from Sydney. Linda, very good to talk to you this afternoon.
Good to talk to you too, Andrew.
As we've seen with those US protests, they tend to be reverberating now around the world. Is it likely that Australians will now question this nation's treatment to our Indigenous Australians?
Well, I make no comment on what's going on in America. That's not my place, except to say that I was listening to the radio overnight, and I think it's become a much bigger issue than the death of Mr. Floyd. And it seems to me that this is an issue of equality and frustration. In Australia, we had the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, which still is a very significant reminder of the situation for First Nations people in this country. And it's a very big issue in the Aboriginal community. There have been over 430 deaths in custody since that Royal Commission, which examined 99 deaths. And we also know, Andrew, just in the last 12 months, there's been a death in Victoria, 2 deaths in Western Australia, and of course the shooting death of Kamadju Walker in Yuendamu just last November.
Yeah, as you pointed out, more than 30 years since that Royal Commission. As far as the recommendations that were made at that time, how many have been implemented successfully?
Well, not very many. What happened is that Royal Commission laid responsibility at both the federal and state governments. And of course there was various committees set up to monitor the implementation. But I have to say that that report, the recommendations of the Royal Commission were cherry-picked, and not all of them were implemented anywhere. And I think that's the tragedy of it, really. Perhaps if they had been all implemented, we would not be seeing the terrible outcomes for First Nations people in custody in Australia that we see today. There are many things that could be done to, I think, address the situation, but when you actually look at the statistics, they're absolutely stark. And these are just statistics, but they are also real people, Andrew, and that's what we've got to remember. In the Northern Territory, for example, something like 90% of the adult prison population is Aboriginal. In many other states and territories, including Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia and New South Wales, the Indigenous prison population is over 30%. And one of the enormous tragedies is that the rate of Aboriginal children going into statutory care is up around 40% across the country. And the rate of Aboriginal young people in custody is also absolutely enormous.
We saw that protest in Perth last night, essentially in support of the protests taking place in the United States. But more importantly, people at that protest in Perth were saying, well, at the moment, Indigenous justice here does not get the same social and political attention that it deserves.
I think that probably people could say that, particularly when you look at the 7 days of absolute activism that's just grown and grown in America and is reaching out across the world, including the United Kingdom, including Australia, and I suspect a number of other places. But when you really examine what the issues are for First Nations people in this country, it is a tragedy. The social justice outcomes are just absolutely appalling. You have a look at the rate of Aboriginal people in jail and the reasons they go to jail. Many of them are very short sentences. there has to be a better way to do things. And I think that this issue that's brought this to light in America is a chance for Australia to re-examine what the record is here and make some substantial changes into the way that custodial sentences are dealt with and the way in which Aboriginal people are incarcerated in Australia.
And Linda Burney, can I just turn to the effects of the pandemic as they stand at the moment? Of course, in a lot of remote Indigenous communities, the people are still in strict lockdown. How is that affecting them at this point?
Well, one of the wonderful things, if you can say there's anything wonderful out of the terrible period that we're in now in Australia, there haven't been any infections in remote communities. And of course, the National Biosecurity Act plus the actions of various state and territory governments have been the reason why we haven't seen what were potential and still potential dreadful outcomes in remote communities. But the issue that you're raising is a very important one, and that is that many of the remote communities are still in lockdown, where the larger towns in those states and territories have lifted a lot of the restrictions. My understanding, Andrew, is that the territory is moving to lift the restrictions next week. I can't talk about South Australia or Western Australia, but obviously there are communities saying, well, is it not time for those restrictions to be lifted? But the real point is the safety and security of those communities. And I have to say this, Andrew, as well, is that it is important for non-Aboriginal people in this country to understand the position and the poverty that still exists in Aboriginal communities, which is a blight on this nation broadly.
Shadow Indigenous Affairs spokeswoman Linda Burney, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew.